I found out my daughter-in-law tried to sell my burial plot while I was still alive, and the worst part was not the paperwork or the money, but the calm way she said I wouldn't need it for years. I was 74 then, still walking to the store, on my own, still paying my bills on time, still breathing without asking permission. And yet, somewhere behind my back, I had already been moved into the category of future inconvenience. My name is Margaret Hale. I have lived long enough to know that death itself is not the cruelest thing people do. Erasing you while you are still here is worse. I bought that burial plot 12 years ago, the same week I buried my husband, Thomas. We had been married 46 years. He is there now, under a modest stone, with his name carved carefully, no flourishes. I bought the adjacent plot for myself on the same day. Not out of sadness, but out of order. I have always believed in taking care of things before they become problems for others. My son, Daniel, knew about it. He drove me to the cemetery that day. He stood beside me while I signed the papers and nodded when I said I wanted to be placed next to his father when my time came. His wife, Claire, knew too. I told her later, casually, over tea, because she liked to know where everything stood. She smiled politely and said it was very sensible. I remember that word clearly. For years, nothing about that decision came up again. Life went on in its quiet, predictable way. I minded my routines. I stayed out of their marriage. I helped when I was asked and stayed silent when I was not. I learned, as many women of my age have, that silence is often rewarded with temporary peace. I would not have known about the burial plot at all if a clerk from the cemetery had not called me one Tuesday afternoon to clarify ownership details. His voice was cautious, the way people sound when they are walking on ice. He asked if I had authorized a third party to inquire about resale options on my plot. I told him no. He hesitated, then gave me a name, Claire's maiden name. He apologized and said there must have been a misunderstanding. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the small crack in the wall near the window. That crack had been there since the winter of '98. I had patched it once, but it always came back. Some things do. When I finally asked Daniel about it, he didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said Claire was just exploring options, and that I shouldn't take it personally. He said the words gently, as if that made them lighter. I remember thinking that no one explores options unless they believe they have the right to choose. Later, when I spoke to Claire directly, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't apologize. She said it made sense financially and that plots were wasted assets if left unused for decades. Then she laughed softly and said, "You're healthy, Margaret. You won't need it for years." That was the moment something settled inside me, heavy and final. They were not waiting for my death. They were planning around it. And for the first time in my life, I understood that being alive was no longer enough to be considered present. I did not buy that plot because I was afraid of dying. I bought it because I was tired of leaving unfinished things behind me. After Thomas died, I learned very quickly how many decisions people expect a widow to make while her hands are still shaking. What music, what flowers, what prayers, what paperwork. Everyone means well, but no one slows down for your grief. Thomas had been practical to the end. Even in the hospital, when the machines were louder than his voice, he worried about details. "Don't let them fuss over you," he told me once. "Just do what makes sense." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he ever said. The week after the funeral, when the house was quiet again and people stopped calling, I drove myself to the cemetery. I wore my brown coat and sensible shoes. I didn't cry there. I had already cried enough at home. I spoke with a woman in a small office who slid forms across the desk and explained my options. She talked about sections, pricing, maintenance fees. I listened carefully and asked questions. Then I pointed to the plot beside my husband's and said, "That one, and the next one." She looked at me for a second, surprised, then nodded. "Planning ahead," she said. "Yes," I answered, "so no one else has to." I paid in full. I signed my name in neat, steady handwriting. When Daniel picked me up afterward, I told him what I'd done. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Okay, Mom," the way he always did when he didn't want to argue. At that time, his silence didn't hurt. It felt like respect. Claire reacted differently when she found out months later. She asked practical questions, the kind that sound reasonable on the surface. Was it transferable? Could it be sold later if plans changed? Was it a good investment? I told her it wasn't an investment. It was a decision. She smiled and said she understood. Looking back, I realized she understood more than I did. I have never been sentimental about possessions. After Thomas passed, I donated most of his clothes, kept only what had meaning. I downsized my cabinets, labeled my files, wrote my name on everything that mattered. I did these things quietly, without announcing them, because I believed that order was a kindness. For a long time, that belief guided me. I didn't interfere when Daniel and Claire argued. I didn't comment on how quickly decisions were made or how rarely I was consulted. I told myself that children grow up and lives move on. I reminded myself that being needed less was the natural price of aging with dignity. The burial plot fit neatly into that thinking. It was settled, done, respectful. I never imagined it would become a topic of discussion while I was still cooking my own meals and paying my own taxes. I never imagined someone would look at that patch of ground and see opportunity instead of rest. When I think back now, I can see small signs I ignored. Claire's questions about property values, her interest in paperwork, her habit of speaking about the future as if it were already divided and assigned. At the time, I told myself I was being suspicious. Old women, I had learned, are expected to smile and not question motives. So I smiled. I stayed polite. I kept my voice even. And all the while, without my knowledge, my place beside my husband was being discussed as if it were empty already. By the time Claire came into Daniel's life, I was already used to being careful. Careful with my words. Careful with my presence. Careful not to seem like a woman who expected too much space in other people's homes. I was 68 then, still working part-time at the library, still driving myself everywhere, still very much capable of managing my own affairs. I told myself that was enough. Claire was never openly rude to me. That would have been easier to understand. She was polite, efficient, always correct. She sent thank you cards. She remembered birthdays. She called me Margaret, never Mom, never Mrs. Hale. Always Margaret, as if we were colleagues who happened to share a last name by accident. Daniel changed in small ways after he married her, not all at once, not in a way you could point to and name. He called less often, but always had reasons. Work was busy. Claire had a headache. They were tired. I accepted those explanations because mothers are trained to accept them. We are taught early on that love means adjustment. I learned quickly that my role was to be useful but invisible. I could help with childcare when asked, but I was not to give advice. I could contribute financially to holidays or repairs, but I was not to ask questions. When Claire spoke about their plans, she spoke in the plural. We decided. We think. Daniel would nod beside her, silent. agreeable. I told myself this was marriage, that compromise was normal, that stepping back was the mature thing to do. What I did not see at first was how often decisions were being made about me without me. Claire liked lists. She liked folders. She liked to know where everything stood. When Daniel once mentioned that I had already arranged my funeral preferences, she asked to see the documents. I laughed it off and said there was no hurry. She smiled and said, "Of course," but I could feel her attention sharpen. There were other moments, casual ones. She asked once whether I planned to sell my house eventually. Another time, she wondered aloud whether I had considered downsizing, always framed as concern, always followed by reassurance that it was just a thought. I answered calmly. I stayed vague. I had learned that clarity invites interference. Looking back, I see that Claire never spoke of my life as something unfolding. She spoke of it as something winding down. She used phrases like later on and eventually and when it makes sense. She talked about my future the way people talk about storage units, temporary holding spaces waiting to be cleared. Daniel never stopped her. That hurt more than her words. Silence, when it comes from your own child, has a weight that is hard to explain. It presses on your chest long after the conversation ends. Still, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being sensitive. Old women are expected to doubt themselves before doubting others. So I did. I smiled. I kept showing up when invited. I brought food. I brought checks when emergencies appeared. I listened more than I spoke. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, stayed kind, stayed out of the way, I would remain welcome. What I did not understand then was that I was already being measured, sorted, and quietly set aside. I would like to say I confronted her immediately, that I raised my voice or demanded explanations the moment the truth surfaced. But that is not how women of my generation are built. We are trained to sit with information first, to test it in silence, to see whether it changes shape when left alone. After the call from the cemetery, I did nothing for 2 days. I washed dishes. I watered my plants. I went to bed at the same hour. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inside, something was loosening, like a thread pulled just far enough that you know the seam will never be the same again. The third day, Claire called me herself. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. She asked about my blood pressure, about the weather, about whether I had finally fixed the loose hinge on my back door. She talked the way people do when they believe they are in control of the conversation. Then, without pausing, she mentioned the cemetery. "I hope you don't mind," she said, as if she were commenting on a different brand of tea. I made a few inquiries, just informational. It seemed practical. That was when I realized the clerk had not misunderstood anything at all. I asked her directly what kind of inquiries she meant. There was a brief pause on the line, not long enough to be guilt, just long enough to rearrange her tone. "Well," she said, "plots are assets, Margaret. Some of them increase in value. I thought it would be irresponsible not to at least know our options." Our. The word landed heavily. I told her I had not authorized any discussion of resale. She replied that no papers had been signed, that nothing was final, that I was getting ahead of myself. Then she said it, the sentence that still echoes in my head when the house is quiet. "You won't need it for years," she said gently. "And Daniel and I are thinking long term." I remember gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. I did not shout. I did not cry. I asked her what exactly she meant by long term. She explained it the way one explains something obvious to a child: money tied up in unused property. future expenses, emergencies. She spoke about my burial place as if it were an empty parking space no one was using efficiently. When I asked why she hadn't spoken to me first, she sounded genuinely surprised. "I didn't think it was necessary yet," she said. "We didn't want to worry you." Worry me? As if the issue were my nerves, not my existence. That evening, Daniel came by. Claire had already spoken to him. I could tell because he walked in prepared, his shoulders stiff, his answers practiced. He said Claire meant well. He said she was only trying to be sensible. He said no harm had been done. I asked him whether he believed I was finished planning my own life. He didn't answer right away. He looked tired, older than he had a right to look. When he finally spoke, he said, "Mom, you're taking this too personally." That was the moment I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a shift. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the owner of my future and become a variable in someone else's calculations. They were not waiting for my death. They were organizing their lives as if it were already accounted for. What surprised me most in the days that followed was not anger. It was the absence of it. I kept waiting for rage to arrive, loud and hot, the way it does in stories. Instead, what settled over me was something colder, heavier, almost clinical. A clear understanding that I had crossed an invisible line without noticing when it was drawn. I woke up the next morning and made my coffee the same way I always did. 2 teaspoons of grounds, no sugar. I read the paper. I folded it neatly. From the outside, I looked like a woman continuing her life. Inside, I felt as if I had been quietly pronounced irrelevant. I kept replaying Claire's words in my mind, not the cruelty of them, but their certainty. "You won't need it for years." There was no hesitation in her voice, no awareness that saying such a thing requires authority. She had spoken as if my time belonged to her schedule. I began to notice how often I had worked to make myself small. How many times I had reassured people that I was fine, that I didn't need anything, that they shouldn't worry about me. I had said those things to be kind. I had said them to avoid being a burden. And somewhere along the way, they had been taken as permission. I thought about all the times I chose silence instead of discomfort. The times I swallowed questions because I didn't want to seem difficult. The times I let decisions pass without comment because I believed harmony mattered more than clarity. I had confused peace with safety. What hurt most was not the burial plot itself. It was the realization that they had spoken about my death more freely than they spoke to me about my life. That conversations were happening in which I was an object, not a participant. That my absence was already being rehearsed. I sat at my kitchen table one afternoon and took out a notepad. I hadn't planned to write anything down. My hand moved on its own. Dates. Conversations. Small remarks I had brushed aside at the time. Patterns became visible when placed next to each other. Concern that always pointed in one direction. Practicality that only benefited them. I was not dealing with a moment. I was dealing with a mindset. There was shame in that realization. Not shame toward them, but toward myself. I had spent years believing that if I stayed reasonable, I would be respected. That if I didn't demand space, it would be offered voluntarily. I had raised my son to stand on his own feet, and in doing so, I had slowly stepped off my own. That afternoon, I walked through my house with different eyes. The chair where Thomas used to sit. The cabinet where our documents were kept. The bedroom where I still slept alone. This was not a temporary place. This was my life, fully formed, still active, still mine. For the first time since the phone call, I allowed myself to name what had happened. I had been moved, quietly and efficiently, from the present into the future tense, and I understood, with a calm that frightened me, that if I did nothing now, there would be more decisions made in my name, without my voice. I did not know yet what I would do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Waiting, hoping, and staying polite had already cost me more than I was willing to lose. I decided to speak to Daniel again, not because I believed he would suddenly understand, but because silence had already done enough damage. I called him myself and asked him to come by. I did not explain why. I did not soften my tone. I simply said I wanted to talk. He arrived that evening after work, still wearing his jacket, still carrying the day with him. He looked around the kitchen as if checking whether anything had changed. Nothing had. The same table, the same chairs, the same woman who had raised him. That seemed to confuse him. We sat across from each other. I waited for him to speak first. He didn't. So I asked him a simple question. "Did you know your wife was trying to sell my burial plot?" He exhaled slowly and nodded once. Not a yes, not a no. A gesture meant to smooth things over. "She wasn't trying to sell it," he said. "She was just asking questions." I asked him whether he believed there was a difference. He shrugged and said, "Claire liked to plan ahead." He said I had always been practical too, as if that made it a compliment. I told him I was not an object to be planned around. I told him that speaking about my death as if it were an inconvenience on a calendar was not concern, it was entitlement. He listened the way people listen when they are waiting for their turn to respond. He said I was overreacting. He said Claire hadn't meant any harm. He said I was still healthy and should take it as a compliment. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I asked him why he hadn't stopped her. That was when he looked away. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he said. "You're always saying you don't want to be a burden." There it was, a sentence I had spoken 100 times, handed back to me like a signed permission slip. I told him I meant I didn't want to be helpless, not that I wanted to be erased. I told him there was a difference between independence and disposability. He frowned, as if I were complicating something that had already been neatly filed away. "Mom," he said, rubbing his face, "you're making this into something it doesn't have to be." I realized then that he was not uncomfortable with what had been done. He was uncomfortable that I had noticed. I asked him whether he saw me as someone still living her life or as someone slowly exiting it. He didn't answer. He said he was tired. He said work had been stressful. He said we could talk later. Later. The word people use when they don't intend to change anything. I told him there would not be a later. That decisions involving me would no longer be discussed without me. That my arrangements, my property, and my body were not family assets. He looked genuinely startled, as if I had broken an unspoken agreement. "You don't have to be so dramatic," he said. I stood up then, not because I was angry, but because the conversation was over. I told him he could go. He hesitated, then left without hugging me. After the door closed, I stood alone in my kitchen and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not grief, not rage. Resolve. For the first time, I understood that my son was not going to protect me from his wife's calculations. And if I wanted to remain the author of my own life and death, I would have to act before someone else finished the story for me. Claire came to see me 2 days later. She did not call first. She never did when she believed she was in the right. She arrived mid-morning, when she knew I would be home, carrying a tone that suggested reason, not apology. She sat down at my kitchen table as if it were her own and folded her hands neatly in front of her. She looked composed, prepared. This was not a conversation she feared. It was one she intended to manage. "I think there's been a lot of unnecessary tension," she began. "Daniel says you're very upset." I told her I was not upset. I was paying attention. That seemed to throw her off balance for a moment. She recovered quickly. "I really wish you wouldn't see this as something personal," she said. "It's just practical thinking. At our age," she stopped herself and smiled. "Well, at some point, arrangements have to make sense for the whole family." The whole family. I noticed how easily I had been absorbed into a collective that somehow excluded my consent. I asked her why she believed she had the right to explore selling something that did not belong to her. She didn't bristle. She didn't deny it. She leaned back slightly and spoke as if explaining a budget line. "We're trying to plan responsibly," she said. "You have assets that are sitting idle. Money that could help now instead of being tied up in the ground for decades." I asked her if she hurt herself. She smiled, patient, almost indulgent. "Margaret, please. No one is wishing anything bad on you. But you're 74. Statistically speaking." I raised my hand. Not sharply, just enough to stop her. "I am not a statistic," I said. "I am alive." She sighed, the way people do when they believe emotions are getting in the way of logic. "You're taking this too emotionally," she replied. "Daniel and I are thinking ahead. You won't need that plot for years. It's just sitting there." Sitting there, like an unused chair, like a coat no one wears anymore. I asked her if she had ever considered that the plot was not about death, but about choice, about dignity, about deciding for myself where I would rest. She tilted her head, studying me. "You already made that decision," she said. "That's the point. You've done your part. Now we're just optimizing." Optimizing. That was the word that settled everything for me. I realized then that she did not see me as a person whose wishes continued to matter. She saw me as a completed project, something finished, filed, and ready for reallocation. I told her calmly that the plot was not for sale, that no one but me had authority over it, that any further inquiries would be considered interference. Her expression hardened slightly. "You don't have to be so rigid," she said. "Families make compromises." I looked at her and felt something quiet and irreversible pass through me. "Compromise," I said, "requires two equal voices. You spoke about my death without inviting mine." She stood up then, smoothing her jacket, clearly irritated. "I think you're being unreasonable," she said. "But that's your choice." "Yes," I answered. "It is." After she left, the house was very quiet. I stood by the window for a long time, watching her car disappear down the street. I felt no urge to cry, no need to explain myself further. I understood now. This was not about misunderstanding or poor communication. It was about power, and I had waited long enough to take mine back. That night, I did not sleep. Not because my mind was racing, but because it was unusually clear. Sleep usually comes when the edges of thought blur. That night, everything was sharp. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, the small familiar sounds I had known for decades, the soft click in the radiator, the distant hum of a car passing on the road. This house had held my life in all its ordinary forms. Birthdays, arguments, illness, laughter, grief. It had never felt temporary to me. At some point before dawn, I got up and turned on the light in the living room. I opened the drawer where I kept important papers. Not in a rush, not with shaking hands. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you finally know what you are looking for. There were documents I hadn't touched in years. Deeds, insurance policies, old correspondence. I spread them across the table and began to sort them into neat piles. Mine. Shared. Obsolete. As I worked, memories surfaced, not painfully, but insistently. Moments when I had signed things without asking questions. Moments when I had trusted that my intentions would be understood. Trust, I realized, is only safe when it is mutual. I found the receipt for the burial plot folded carefully inside a folder. My name was there, clear and unmistakable. I traced the letters with my finger, grounding myself in the fact of it. This was real. This was mine. No interpretation required. I thought of Thomas then. Not of his death, but of his presence. Of the way he used to say, "Don't let people decide things for you because it's convenient for them." He had said it once, years ago, when a neighbor tried to pressure us into something that didn't sit right. I hadn't thought of that moment in a long time. I sat at the table until the sky outside began to lighten. When the sun finally came up, I made tea and drank it slowly, watching the steam rise. I felt tired, but steady. The kind of tiredness that comes after a decision has already been made somewhere deeper than words. What struck me most was not fear of confrontation, but relief. I had spent so long managing other people's comfort that I had forgotten what it felt like to prioritize my own clarity. There was a quiet dignity in simply acknowledging that something was wrong and refusing to smooth it over. By mid-morning, I knew what I had to do next. Not emotionally, practically. I needed to stop assuming that goodwill would protect me. I needed to put boundaries into writing, where intentions could not be reinterpreted or dismissed. I needed someone who dealt in facts, not family dynamics. For years, I had avoided lawyers the way people avoid admitting something has gone too far. It felt extreme, final. But lying there in the early light, I understood that waiting had already allowed others to move ahead of me. This was no longer about a burial plot. It was about the right to remain the final authority over my own life, while I was still living it. By the time I picked up the phone later that morning, my hand was steady. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I chose the lawyer the same way I chose most important things in my life. Quietly, without asking for opinions. A small firm 2 towns over, recommended years ago by a neighbor whose divorce had been handled with dignity and silence. I had kept the card in a drawer, never thinking I would need it. Now it felt like it had been waiting for me. When I called, I did not explain myself. I asked for an appointment and was given one 3 days later. The woman on the phone spoke calmly, efficiently, as if my call were an ordinary thing. That steadiness reassured me more than kindness would have. In the days before the meeting, I prepared. Not emotionally, but practically. I made a list of everything that belonged to me and everything anyone else had ever assumed they could touch. Accounts, documents, permissions I had given casually, without imagining they would one day be used against my own interests. I was startled by how long the list became once I stopped minimizing it. I also paid attention to myself, to how often I had excused other people's behavior, to how quickly I reached for understanding instead of protection. I realized that much of what I called generosity had actually been avoidance. Avoidance of conflict, avoidance of disappointment, avoidance of seeing clearly. The morning of the appointment, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to anchor myself. A gray blouse, a jacket I had owned for years, shoes that didn't hurt my feet. I wanted nothing about that day to feel rushed or borrowed. The lawyer, a woman in her early 50s, listened without interrupting. I told her everything, from the burial plot to the conversations, from the assumptions to the language that had been used about my life, as if it were already closing. I expected her to react, to frown, or express outrage. She didn't. She nodded, took notes, and asked precise questions. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said, "You did the right thing by coming now." That sentence loosened something in me I hadn't known was still tight. She explained my options slowly, clearly, what could be protected, what needed to be clarified, what permissions should be revoked, and which documents needed to be updated so that no one could claim confusion later. She spoke about control not as power, but as responsibility. "You're not being dramatic," she said at one point. "You're being proactive. There's a difference." We talked about the burial plot specifically, how ownership worked, how to formally block any future inquiries or transactions without my explicit consent. It was all very simple once it was stated plainly. The complexity had lived entirely in my hesitation. By the time I left her office, I felt lighter, but not relieved. Relief implies an ending. What I felt was steadiness, direction. On the drive home, I thought about how strange it was that taking legal steps felt less aggressive than staying silent had. Silence had cost me sleep, confidence, and the illusion of safety. Clarity, even written in firm language, felt kinder. That afternoon, I placed the lawyer's card on my kitchen counter instead of hiding it away. I made tea. I sat at the table where so many conversations had happened without me, and felt, for the first time in a long while, fully present in my own life. This was not an act of revenge. It was not punishment. It was recognition. And it was long overdue. The second meeting with the lawyer was not dramatic. That in itself felt important. There were no raised voices, no emotional speeches, no sense that something irreversible was being done in haste. It was paperwork, explanation, and choice. The kind of work people usually leave until it is too late. She had prepared a folder with my name on it, typed cleanly on the front. Inside were drafts, notes, and a checklist. We went through it line by line. I asked questions. She answered them without rushing me, without simplifying things to make me feel small. We started with authority. Who could act on my behalf and under what conditions? I learned how easily good intentions could turn into overreach when nothing was written down. Permissions I had given years ago casually could still be interpreted as open doors. Those doors needed locks. Then we moved to property, my house, my accounts, the burial plot. Each item was addressed separately, clearly. Nothing vague, nothing assumed. She explained how to formally register restrictions so that no one could make inquiries, let alone decisions, without my written consent. I signed where needed and asked for copies of everything. At one point, she paused and looked at me carefully. "People often wait until someone has already crossed the line," she said. "You're stopping it before it becomes a pattern." That mattered to me. Patterns are what swallow women like me. Small compromises, repeated, until there is nothing left to protect. We discussed my will, not in terms of division, but intention. What I wanted to happen, and just as importantly, what I did not. I made it clear that any attempt to pressure or manipulate me would have consequences, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I wanted my choices to be honored, not negotiated. The meeting lasted longer than I expected, not because it was complicated, but because I took my time. I had earned that. When I walked out of the office, the afternoon light felt different. Not brighter, just steadier, as if something inside me had aligned with the day. I did not call Daniel. I did not inform Claire. There was no announcement to be made. Boundaries do not require explanation to the people who made them necessary. At home, I placed the signed documents in a new folder, clearly labeled. I put it in a drawer that only I accessed. I sat for a moment with my hands folded in my lap and felt something I had not felt in years. Safety. Not the illusion of it that comes from avoiding conflict, but the real kind. The kind built on clarity, intention, and the quiet refusal to be treated as finished while you are still here. For the first time since this began, I slept through the night. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, not calmer, but clearer. There were no dramatic phone calls, no sudden apologies, no confrontations at my door. Life continued, but it did so on different terms, and I could feel the shift even in the smallest routines. I moved through my house with a sense of ownership I had not realized was missing. Every object felt accounted for, not just physically, but deliberately. The documents I had signed were no longer abstract protections. They were a line drawn in ink, and I slept better, knowing that line existed whether anyone respected it or not. Daniel called 3 days later. His voice was cautious, measured, the way it gets when he suspects something has changed and he is unsure how much ground he has lost. He asked how I was feeling, not how I was doing, but how I was feeling. I noticed the difference and answered honestly that I felt fine, steady. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He mentioned Claire only once, in passing, saying she thought things had become a bit tense. I did not respond to that. I had learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of truth. That evening, I took out the folder again and reviewed everything slowly. Not because I doubted my decisions, but because I wanted to be fully present with them. Each page represented a moment where I had chosen myself without apology. I did not feel hardened by it. I felt intact. I thought about how many women my age are praised for endurance when what they have really mastered is erasure. How often we are told we are strong because we tolerate being diminished with grace. I had done that for years, and it had cost me more than I admitted even to myself. This was different. This was not endurance. This was alignment. The burial plot crossed my mind again, not as a symbol of death, but of continuity. It was a place I had chosen when my world had been torn open, a decision made not out of fear, but care. No one else had the right to redefine that care as waste. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt that my future was not something others were managing around me. It was something I was still shaping, quietly, thoughtfully, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to decide. That night, as I turned off the lights and went to bed, I realized something that brought a small, unexpected smile. I was no longer waiting to see what would happen next. I already knew. Whatever came, it would meet me standing. The calls started almost immediately. Daniel's voice was anxious, clipped, different from the careful neutrality he had maintained before. Claire followed with texts, polite but insistent, asking to meet, to talk, to clarify, to explain. I did not answer at first. I let them fill the hours with their own agitation while I finished my tea, watched the sunlight shift across the kitchen, and allowed myself the simple comfort of being uninterrupted. When I finally picked up, it was Daniel, hesitant at first, careful not to trigger the sharp tone he had learned I could wield. He asked how I was feeling. I said simply, "I am fine. I have considered my decisions, and I will not change them." He hesitated. That pause carried more weight than a lecture or an apology ever could. Silence has a gravity that words rarely match. He started to speak again, slower this time, as if each sentence were measured against what he thought might be acceptable. He spoke of Claire's concern, of the plans they had made, of how difficult they thought this was for everyone involved. I let him speak, not because I agreed, but because listening is a quiet way of asserting authority. By letting him speak and not yielding, I reinforced the boundaries I had drawn. When he finally ran out of words, I said calmly, "Your concern is noted, but these decisions are mine. No one else may interfere or make assumptions on my behalf." I heard the tension in his breath as he processed that. He tried to argue, to frame my actions as disproportionate, but I held firm. There was nothing more to negotiate. Later that day, Claire called again. Her voice was composed, almost syrupy with practiced concern. She asked whether I would reconsider, whether I might see things differently if they explained their perspective. I did not rise to the bait. I explained once more, in quiet but unyielding terms, that my decisions regarding property, finances, and the burial plot were final. No explanation of their plans would alter what I had legally and deliberately established. I thought about how long I had allowed myself to be absorbed into their narratives of convenience, how carefully I had tailored my life to avoid discomfort. Every quiet act of accommodation, every muted objection, every suppressed question had only encouraged the presumption that I would remain passive. That pattern was broken now. It could not be restored. In the hours that followed, I sorted through correspondence, noting each attempted intrusion, each text and call that sought to adjust my life without my input. I made copies. I organized them by date, not for evidence in court, at least not yet, but for my own clarity. It is remarkable, I thought, how much power is assumed when silence is mistaken for agreement. I did not feel triumph or vindictiveness. Those are noisy emotions, unsuitable for long-term resolution. What I felt was a deep, calm certainty. I had acted before the situation escalated, before the quiet erosion of autonomy became irreparable. I had reclaimed my agency while still fully present, still alive, still the architect of my own days. By evening, the calls and messages slowed. Daniel and Claire had realized, finally, that persistence would not bend my resolve. I prepared a simple dinner, brewed tea, and settled by the window with a book. For the first time in years, I was uninterrupted in both space and intention. I could live as I had chosen, uninterrupted, unnegotiated, and wholly myself. The realization settled quietly over the next few days that the problem had never been the burial plot, nor the legal documents, nor even the casual inquiries. The real issue had been much more subtle, more persistent. It was the assumption that my life could be arranged, measured, and allocated by others as if I were already absent. That assumption had been tolerated, perhaps even encouraged, by my own inaction. I had allowed the narrative to form around me rather than insisting it include me. In those quiet mornings, I walked through my house, noting everything that belonged solely to me. Each photograph, each piece of furniture, every small object carried a memory, a claim, a history that could not be altered by anyone else. I realized that my presence was not defined by the absence of conflict, but by the acknowledgement of authority over my own life. The simple act of asserting control over what had always been mine was transformative. It did not require drama, nor did it require justification to anyone who had not earned it. I began to reflect on the years I had spent accommodating the expectations of others, the birthdays I had smoothed over to avoid inconvenience, the advice I had withheld to preserve peace, the moments I had declined to assert myself because it seemed simpler to be agreeable. Each of these acts, intended as kindness or prudence, had quietly reinforced the perception that my voice could be ignored. It became clear that generosity without boundaries is invisible. The realization was not painful in a dramatic sense, but it carried the weight of recognition. By the middle of the week, the atmosphere had shifted. Daniel's calls were briefer, his tone careful but tentative, as if he were negotiating his own position rather than questioning mine. Claire's messages were polite but restrained, measured now by the understanding that her usual strategies of persuasion and planning would no longer function. The boundaries I had placed through legal measures and personal firmness were now visible, immutable, and unarguable. They could attempt to influence or cajole, but the outcome was already determined by my deliberate actions. This new dynamic allowed me to inhabit my own routines differently. I brewed my morning tea slowly, savoring the warmth, the aroma, and the silence. I lingered over letters and notes without a sense of obligation, moving through the hours as one who is fully present, whose time cannot be preempted. Even small decisions, what to cook, when to step outside, how to arrange my living room, carried a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. These were ordinary choices, yet they were now entirely my own. I also began to consider the emotional landscape I had previously neglected. The quiet dignity of choosing for oneself cannot coexist with fear of retaliation or disapproval. As I acknowledged this, I felt a subtle, enduring calm. The anxiety that had accompanied even minor decisions dissipated. No longer did I weigh every action against how it might be interpreted or challenged. The mental labor of negotiating my existence for others' comfort was over. By the weekend, I had settled into a rhythm that felt wholly authentic. The house, once a space shaped in part by the assumptions of others, now reflected my presence decisively. Each room, each object, each ritual was a testament to agency, to the capacity to assert life fully without permission. It was neither loud nor ostentatious, but the steadiness it imparted resonated deeply. I realized that the real lesson, the quiet but irreversible victory, was not in documents or legal measures, but in the act of reclaiming the narrative of my own life. The pattern of erasure had been broken, and in its place was clarity, self-respect, and a presence that could not be negotiated away. The following days were quiet in a way that felt unusual, but necessary. There was no sense of confrontation, no lingering tension that required management. Daniel's calls were brief, hesitant, and careful, as though he were walking on unfamiliar ground. Claire did not reach out, perhaps recognizing finally that her usual methods of persuasion could not succeed. The house, which had once felt like a stage for other people's narratives, now belonged entirely to me. The quiet was not empty. It was deliberate, settled, and filled with a newfound awareness of presence. I moved through my days differently, noticing small details that had once gone unobserved. The sunlight across the living room carpet, the sound of the wind through the old trees outside, the way the kitchen smelled after baking bread or brewing tea. Each ordinary observation was now imbued with significance because it was experienced on my own terms, without pretense, without accommodation. It was a clarity that comes not from absence of challenge, but from having established boundaries that could not be questioned. Even my memories took on a different quality. I thought of Thomas and the years we had shared, not as a measure of what had been lost, but as a guide to how to live fully in the time that remained. I considered the ways I had allowed other people to define my role in my own home, in my own life, and recognized the cumulative effect of quiet concessions. Each small compromise, each suppression of voice had slowly created a landscape in which my opinions, desires, and decisions could be overlooked. Now, each choice I made, however mundane, was a declaration of self-possession. I spent mornings in the kitchen, preparing meals without consulting anyone, arranging objects on counters with intention, and allowing myself the satisfaction of routine performed wholly for my own benefit. I read books I had shelved years ago, revisiting passages that once brought joy and reflection, now fully absorbed without interruption. I maintained correspondence, but only with those who treated me as a person whose presence mattered. Even the small act of sorting letters, making notes, and filing papers became a form of reclamation. I was tending not just my home, but my life. In the evenings, I would sit by the window and watch the neighborhood settle into quiet. Other houses contained conversations, meals, and laughter that I no longer needed to mediate or participate in unless I chose to. The knowledge that my decisions regarding the burial plot, my finances, and my property were now legally and practically secure brought a profound ease. I could exist fully, without the constant calculation of others' expectations, without the anxious preemption of conflict that had once defined my interactions. This clarity extended into my relationships as well. Daniel and Claire remained in contact, but the dynamic had shifted. Their attempts to influence or direct were now tempered by the understanding that I would not be passive. I was polite, composed, and consistent. There was no drama, no argument, no need for justification. My silence became a kind of statement, deliberate and impenetrable, reinforcing the boundaries I had drawn. They could choose to respond or not, but the conditions of my life would not be compromised. In this rhythm of daily life, I discovered a quiet contentment. Not the excitement of victory, nor the relief of triumph, but the steady, enduring satisfaction of self-determination. I had reclaimed what had been quietly taken, not through confrontation, but through deliberate assertion and preparation. Each act, from signing documents to maintaining routines, reinforced the principle that my life, my home, and my future belonged to me. I moved through the days with a calm confidence that had been absent for decades, aware that the narrative of my life was now authored by no one but myself, and in that authorship lay an unshakable, quiet victory. In the weeks that followed, life did not transform into something dramatic or new. It became something honest. The days came and went with their usual rhythm, but I no longer felt as though I were moving through them on borrowed time. I woke when I wished, ate when I was hungry, rested when my body asked for it. No one monitored my choices. No one anticipated my absence. I was simply here, fully and undeniably alive. Daniel adjusted, as people do when they realize a door they assumed was open has quietly closed. He spoke more carefully now, choosing his words with an awareness that had been missing before. Claire remained distant. I did not mistake that distance for respect, but I accepted it as an acknowledgement of limits. Not all lessons come with reconciliation. Some arrive with space, and that is enough. I returned to the cemetery one afternoon, alone. The grounds were quiet, the grass neatly trimmed, the air still. I stood beside Thomas's stone for a long time, not in grief, but in recognition. I told him, silently, that everything was in order, that no one would decide for me anymore. That I had done what needed to be done, not just for my death, but for my life. What I understood then was simple and unshakable. Dignity is not something granted by family, age, or circumstance. It is something claimed. I had spent years being careful, accommodating, patient. None of those things protected me when someone decided I was already finished. Only action did that. There is a particular freedom that comes when you stop trying to be understood and focus instead on being secure. I no longer explained myself. I no longer softened the truth to preserve comfort. I lived quietly but firmly, anchored in decisions that could not be undone by someone else's convenience. I am 74 years old. I still walk to the store. I still laugh at the wrong moments. I still make plans. And when my time does come, it will meet me as I am now, whole, accounted for, and unafraid. No one will erase me before then. If this story feels familiar, if you have ever been treated as invisible while still breathing, then you already know why I chose to speak. Leave a comment if you recognize yourself here. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, written for women who refuse to disappear quietly, then stay. We are not done yet.